Following the work into the last video, covering the gruesome incident that took place on the night of July 1st, 1981 on Wonderland Avenue in Los Angeles, California, and what would later be called and coined the Wonderland Murders. We learned of the dark and twisted saga that brought together notorious figures throughout Los Angeles / Hollywood party scene and underworld, including the likes of infamous adult film star John Holmes, a notorious gangster and power player within the city, Eddie Nash. Nash seemed to have his hands everywhere in the city of Los Angeles at his peak, and his main title and occupation was the owning and operation of several nightclubs throughout the LA area. Of those clubs that Nash owned, one of them will be the topic of today's bonus episode. A place that seems to raise a few eyebrows upon inspection, with accusations of being a hub of sex trafficking, drug use and distribution, sexual perversion and exploitation, and even a case of murder. All again in the heart of Hollywood and Los Angeles, a place that drew in celebrities and your average party kid alike. The interest in this topic and video is gained from working on the previous Wonderland episode, but the true story that spiked my interest was leaked audio from late 2021, an amazing phone call in which the caller, a man named Richie Albertini, who phoned CPS, or Child Protective Services in California, and told a riveting tale that began in his teenage years in the 1980s in Los Angeles, and covered the decades that followed as he worked at some of Hollywood's most popular and hottest clubs and became involved with the seedy figures of Los Angeles and the underworld. The call drags on for the first 20 minutes as the CPS worker at first disbelieves Albertini's story, and the two argue back and forth. Once they realize they used to hang out in the same type of circles and know many of the same people, the CPS worker realizes it's no hoax after all, and takes the call seriously. The topics discussed in the call range from River Phoenix's death to actor Peter Green's killing of a man, to family members of politicians like Nancy Pelosi hiring Albertini to intimidate their enemies. A bulk of the phone call involves child trafficking, something that Albertini describes as horrifically prevalent in the 1980s in Los Angeles, and he claims that one of the main hubs for trafficking was a club named the Odyssey.
In West Hollywood back then, there was a nightclub that all of us kids hung out at. It was a trafficking mecca. It was called the Odyssey.
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
When you were hanging out at this place,
Yes.
was there drugs involved?
All the time. Constantly.
Okay.
Which they discussed extensively during the call. Massive amounts of drugs were everywhere, according to Albertini. Albertini claims that there was even more than that going on at the Odyssey. He claims the club was a front for child sex trafficking. He basically describes the place as a horror show of underage kids being sold for sex in the club's offices, back rooms, and parking lots. Albertini also claims that Nash's co-owner of the Odyssey was infamous adult film star John Holmes. And though evidence of this is hard to find, it is a proven fact that John Holmes and Nash were closely linked with each other before their eventual downfall. Another claim that Albertini makes on the phone call is that the third owner of the Odyssey was a man named Larry Benjamin, a supposed rampant child abuser, who Albertini says was eventually murdered by a 14-year-old boy who he was molesting. Benjamin's murder isn't some rumor or theory either. It actually happened. An LA Times article from January 20th, 1984 describes Larry Benjamin's murder. Benjamin, a 42-year-old man who was described as a regular at the Odyssey Nightclub, was found dead by his 16-year-old roommate on the early morning of January 8th, 1984. A 14-year-old boy, name withheld, who Benjamin met at the Odyssey, was a frequent guest at his condo, was arrested for the murder. Again, alarms were raised when a 42-year-old man who's described as a regular at a teenage nightclub has a 16-year-old roommate and hangs out frequently with a 14-year-old boy he met at the club, who he was alone with in the middle of the night when the boy shot him dead. People were quick to have suspicions to the real motive and relationship that Larry Benjamin had with these boys that he had met at the club. The Odyssey Nightclub, which opened in 1976 at 8471 Beverly Boulevard, catered to the under 21 set, who would be able to hang out and dance to the sounds of disco, new wave, pop, and rock hits of the time spun by DJs, where young people of all ages would be able to dance the night away, with the Odyssey staying open until 5 a.m. Although legally prohibited from allowing drinking after losing their liquor license, the lack of alcohol at the club was compensated for, at least for many regulars, by the availability of recreational drugs. And while some youngsters hit the dance floor multiple nights a week, looking for good, clean fun and to make memories with their friends, others revealed part of the darker side of LA nightlife. The Odyssey wasn't formally a gay club, but it did make a welcoming home for the city's young gay men and women, many of whom would later say was the only place they felt at home, as they struggled to cope with their sexual identity. But some of the advertising and promotions of the time seemed to suggest that a more perverse idea of what was truly going on inside the club, with what was said to be one promotion reading Best Discotheque for Gay 12-year-olds and Those Who Like Gay 12-year-olds. The Odyssey, this teeming warehouse of a disco in LA's equivalent of Berlin's pre-war cabarets. The relentless beat shakes every corner of the building, and the joint teams with kids who appear to be too young for PG-13 movies. There's some kind of age limit at the door, but exceptions are made for young dance feveroids with the requisite entry fee. On one visit, we were stopped by a girl who appeared to be no more than 13. She wanted to know if we could sell her any pot, hang out at the juice bar for a while, and a pretty young thing might approach you. It's the place to meet tomorrow's Bianca Jaggers and Halstons. With the glitz and glamour, the club attracted those of all ages, catering to the young party crowd of Los Angeles in that time. The club quickly became popular with the youth, attracting different crowds and subcultures, and attracting the likes of celebrity and pop culture figures of the time, with Richie Albertini mentioning some of the prominent figures he personally associated with in the club during his leaked audio. To understand a bit more about the forces that were behind the Odyssey and nightclubbing in LA in the 1970s and 80s, Consider the club owner, none other than Eddie Nash, the man known ultimately for his role in the Wonderland Murders, and an infamous local figure as a drug dealer and a gangster. In fact, for many, many years, Nash, born Adel Garib Nasrallah in Palestine, was considered one of the richest and most powerful drug dealers and criminals operating on the West Coast at the time. Nash owned several clubs in the LA area, including the Starwood Club in West Hollywood, the Sold Out Club in Hollywood, Paradise Ballroom, the Seven Seas, Alibaba's, and the Kit Kat Strip Club. One of the schemes Nash was associated with was arson for profit in the intentional torching of his own properties to collect insurance money. A government informant linked him to the crimes, but in June of 1982, Nash was acquitted. He also seemed just mildly inconvenienced by the ensuing trial, with the LA Times writing, Nash, an impassive, cadaverous man who frequently dozed off in the courtroom, sprang to his feet, smiled, and waved at the jury after the verdicts were read by a U.S. District Judge, Matt Brine. Asked later how he felt, Nash said, and I quote, "All I want to do is get out of here." It was just a few months later that Nash was convicted on drug charges and spent until November of 1984 released after serving just half his term. A few months after that, a mysterious fire signaled the official day the music died at the Odyssey. But before we look at the unexplained fire that finally silenced the Odyssey, the events leading up to its smoky demise are worth revisiting. Though it sounds like a heavenly haven for some, where people are free to express themselves and free of inhibitions of normal society before its eventual destruction, to many, the club was considered the scourge of the neighborhood from the get-go in the mid-1970s. Area residents fought hard to see the club had its permits revoked, a tense matter that came to a head in early 1985 when the Odyssey's dance permit was on the line. An article from the Los Angeles Times dated February 20th, 1985 reads, "For years, residents of the neighborhood had complained that teenagers frequenting the Odyssey, many of whom are as young as 13 and 14, drink alcoholic beverages, consume drugs, and make loud noise, while openly urinating and engaging in sex outside the club." Many of the problems and suspicions seemed evident from the outside looking in, but as per usual, the deeper you looked inside the problem, the darker and more difficult it became, with a place that's supposed to be safe and fun having a darker undertone. Albertini, along with mentioning the case of Corey Feldman and Corey Haim, mentions the case of Robert Arquette, who Albertini was childhood friends with. Robert, of the Arquette acting family, who Albertini claims was extensively abused by older men as a teenager, with some men or incidents having ties back to the club. Robert Arquette, who later transitioned into Alexis Arquette, contracted the HIV virus in 1987 and later passed away September 11th, 2016, after cardiac arrest caused by complications due to the HIV virus. Just being one of the more notable stories of abuse that seemed to stem from the club, besides that of Larry Benjamin and those earlier discussed. The club continued to operate throughout the early 80s, and although Nash being the official owner of the club, day-to-day operations were left to manager Scott Harvey, who was the face of the fight on the club side as the story played out in editorial columns and the nightly local news. In August 1984, the club's dance permit had been revoked, but was reinstated when a set of conditions were applied to its operation, and the club had 6 months to comply. The dance permit was on the line again in February 1985, when those 6 months were up. Some Angelenos were adamant about not letting the Odyssey have its permit permanently reinstated, arguing that the renewal of the Odyssey's club license would be an endorsement of gross violations of our sanitary, moral, health, and zoning laws, a statement summarized by LA resident Carl Levin. The law of the time tended to side with Levin. Harvey tried to get clever with workarounds. When the vote came down to take the permit away, one gimmick was to pay patrons $1 apiece if they wanted to dance, making them technically performers. Harvey said that the agreement was contract labor, but authorities who swooped in and squelched the effort cautioned Harvey and the club could be violating labor laws. Instead, said Harvey, plans were afoot to turn the club from a dance hall into a major entertainment complex. He told the press. One teen patron who called the Odyssey his second home said that they would dance again. If we can't dance inside, we'll dance outside, he told the LA Times.
This place is like a babysitter to these kids sometimes. Sometimes the mother and father will pay $8 or $5 or how much it is to get in here because they know that the kids are having fun. Without this place, they're going to have fun on the streets. And on the streets are worse.
People here are like family.
And although opposition and fight would be put up by the patrons and supporters of the Odyssey over the next year or so, their efforts would eventually be in vain. When on March 29th, 1985, it officially marked the end of the Odyssey for good, with an excerpt from the LA Times reading, "Flames swept through the recently closed Odyssey Nightclub for teenagers in the West Hollywood area Friday afternoon, just after a witness saw a motorist throw what appeared to be an incendiary device through the front window."
Good evening. Arson investigators are looking into a fire that broke out late today at the controversial Odyssey Nightclub. The blaze caused $85,000 in damage. Stan Chambers has the report.
What was left of the trouble-plagued Odyssey Nightclub was destroyed by fire this afternoon. When the first units arrived, the upper floors of both buildings were well involved, with fire pouring out of the front windows. There was also fire on the first floor of the main building. This footage was shot by a French television crew from I.O. Productions. They were just across the street when LA City firefighters brought out their hoses and ladders to battle the blaze.
All the fire was at the front portion of the building, and there was no fire in the rear portion of the building when we arrived on scene. The fire was contained to that particular area.
The buildings were mostly empty and were scheduled to be auctioned off the end of April. The fire marks the final chapter of the former after-hours dance club that was forced to close down because of complaints by neighbors and a failure to comply with guidelines set up by the Los Angeles Police Commission. Several demonstrations were held at the club in the past weeks in an effort by its clientele to keep the dancing club open. Arson investigators are on the scene. This is an incendiary fire. Witnesses say that flammable liquids were thrown into the structure. Stan Chambers.
Club employee David Rubenstein had been inside along with Kevin Parr, who both had to flee the fire. Parr was the manager of Phases in Reseda, another all-ages club run by the same group of guys as the Odyssey. The Los Angeles Fire Department had no doubt about it. This fire had been deliberately set. But who had set the fire? Good question, and one that remains unanswered to this day. The Odyssey was eventually torn down, and should you pass by 8471 Beverly Boulevard now, you'll just see a strip mall in the shadow of the Beverly Center. Memories of the club linger on, with a few web pages devoted to the club and message boards where one-time regulars can connect with old friends and discuss who is still living or has passed on, like Kevin Parr, who by one of the club goers' accounts died in 2003. A Facebook group was also set up to allow former club kids, DJs, employees, and entertainers to share their memories of the music and the madness that was the Odyssey. We hear a reunion took place in 2011 and a documentary was in the works. Was this truly just an innocent club to seek freedom and some sort of expression from the restrictive and judgmental times of the 1980s? To many patrons and people who attended the nightclub in person, it was, with many commenters writing their own thoughts and testimonies of what they saw and felt about going to the club, with one commenter on a YouTube video writing, and I quote, "I went to the Odyssey from 1978 to 1982. The club itself was not creepy, nor were the vast majority of its patrons. Much of what you discussed about Nash was unknown to us regular club goers, outside of the staff and some of the hustlers and Johns that hung out upstairs. It was technically a gay 18 and over disco, not a teen club that had a gay element. Straight kids went, but it was promoted as a gay disco. Unlike other options for young people at the time, the gay kids set the tone. When you were 18 years old in Los Angeles area in the late 1970s and early 80s, you did not consider it teen disco, but a disco for younger people, as there were a huge 18 to 21 crowd to fill clubs. So this was quite regular. It was open until 5 a.m., though one has to remember 21 plus clubs and bars closed at 2 a.m., so it was also an after-hours club for adults. Maybe not a great mix from today's eyes, but these were the times, and there was a club opened at 6 a.m. called Church in that same area for some perspective. During that hour, we got our breakfast at Cantor's, Norm's, or Okie Dog, depending on our funds. Was only open until 5 a.m. on weekends, by the way. During the week, it closed at 4 a.m. You would often see celebrities at the Odyssey, but many of them just blended in and danced and focused on the music, like any 18-plus disco at the time. One has to remember that this was West Hollywood, so celebrities were a regular part of life. The most commonly cited celeb on disco nights was Paul Lynde, and on the new wave nights, it would definitely be Christy McNichol, who was quite the regular. Drugs existed, but in our set, it was acid and cheap pills, nothing too hard. The club was glamorous and progressive, and most of the kids that hung out there were interested in each other, music, and fashion. The new wave night that started on Monday nights and then spread to Wednesday and Fridays was quite distinct from other nights, which we called disco nights. I heard about LB, but never remembered meeting him. On a typical disco night, club goers would hang on the main dance floor and listen and dance to DJ Chuck E. Star, while upstairs in the pool table room, hustlers would gather, and often older men would scope out the scene from the balcony. This was quite ordinary of the era, actually. The times were quite different then. This was before AIDS, and the value of swinging 70s still prevailed, and relationships between younger and older men were commonplace within this world. While much has changed for the better in protecting young people from predators, I did not see some of the seediness when I first went around at age 15 in 1978, but it was more exciting than scary, and one could easily navigate the drugs and exploits in the club, as the main focus was the dance floor. Though younger kids went, it was advertised as 18 plus, and kids under 16 were there, though rare. The three new wave nights had very little in common with disco nights, and you rarely saw the hustler-John dynamic there on new wave nights. The staff was quite friendly and protective. Many housing-challenged kids hung out there and created community, and it was much safer than the streets, and the fact that it was open late meant it sheltered many youth that had been rejected at home. The club was also a respite for kids living in homophobic homes and communities. I can't speak for the disco nights, as I only went to a few, but I know the new wave nights were a refuge for the punk gay kids that could not be totally open in the mainstream punk scene at the time. Many subcultures flourished there, including the new romantic movement, and the Odyssey was culturally important, as being on the cutting edge of dance music. I made many of my first honest friendships in this club, many of which I still have to this day. I hope my perspective helps younger people see the Odyssey from a more well-rounded view. as the mostly unknown shadiness of Nash and his associates was only a small part of the story of this awesome space. Another patron wrote, and I quote, "I remember everyone. Odyssey was the best nightclub. I went dancing here every effing night. I close my eyes and see everyone dancing on a Tuesday night when all the locals came and hung out. Wow, I really wish I could go back in time." End quote. And guys, this is basically the end of the video. If you made it this far, again, I just want to say a quick thank you. If you enjoyed the content, please leave a like, a comment, a subscription, whatever it may be. It helps the channel immensely, and I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. And yeah, guys, for this video, a lot of the work and a lot of the information came from a page called Control Alt History. They have a YouTube channel and a webpage, so please go check them out. Also, I got a lot of information from an article from lahistory.com, so a big shout out to them. Interesting place nonetheless. But again, guys, thank you so much. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.